Grain by Robert Stead. This book comes out of Manitoba, and I also came out of Manitoba. I like this book for a lot of reasons. It came out in 1926. It's about a young man who does not want to go to war, to the First World War. He wants to stay home and keep working on the farm. It's all he's ever done. It's all he's ever wanted to do. And I'm going to read to you from chapter 5 about the threshing, which is one of the highlights of the book for me. My grandmother met my grandfather at a threshing gig. He had come from Manitoba to Saskatchewan, where she was living, and on a threshing crew, and she was one of the women doing the cooking for the crew. Threshing was a great event, as always it is on those farms where grain growing is the major occupation. Several times had Jackson Stead been on the verge of buying a threshing machine of his own, but always he had been deterred by the vigorous opposition of his wife, who insisted that a new house must take precedence over any such investment. And when Susie really insisted, Jackson, who was not without stubbornness on his own account, had the wisdom to temporize, with the result that the machine was not bought, nor was the house built. Bill Powers was the chief thresherman of the community. He had graduated from the old horsepower days into the steam engine class in the early 90s, and was now wearing out his third machine, which, with the assistance of his homestead quarter, carried the accumulated mortgages passed on by its predecessors. Bill's credit was a matter of high finance on a small scale. He bought oil, grease, and belting from the square deal hardware store by given orders, payable after threshing, on such comparatively solid farmers as Jackson Stead. He had little trouble with men leaving him during the rush of the season, because he never had enough money to pay them off. How he managed at the end of the term no one seemed to understand. But he was a good thresher. He took all the wheat out of the straw. He wasted nothing. He cleaned up after the sets as conscientiously when the farmer was away as when he stood at his elbow. He gave 60 pounds to the bushel and a little over. It was said of Bill Powers that his thresher's measure was always better than the elevator weight, and in 15 years' threshing with steam he never had had a fire. Jackson Stead had fallen into the way of engaging him each year after the annual debate with Mrs. Stead on the buying of a threshing machine had been settled in the negative. It was late at night, near the end of September, when Power's outfit moved onto the Stead farm from Gordon's, a mile or two to the south. Mr. Stead and his hired man were helping their neighbors with his threshing, and Gander was at home filling mangers and in his small way getting ready for the gang. His mother also was getting ready, but in no small way. The cook car, in which the thresher feeds his men, was an innovation in those days not yet adopted by Mr. Powers, although he had so far fallen in line with the march of progress as to carry with his outfit a caboose in which the gang slept during the all-too-brief hours between quitting at night and starting time in the morning. The result of such an arrangement was that the farmer's wife had to be ready, frequently at short notice, to feed 18 or 20 additional men, each equipped with the most ravenous appetite, and to feed them well. If you don't mind waiting, I know, but I'm reading. Could you just wait a minute? Please. That's a good boy. All right. To feed the threshers well was a matter of honor among the farm women, and in this culinary competition Mrs. Stead excelled. It never had been said of Mrs. Stead, nor would it while she had the power to bake and boil, that she had failed to rise to the occasion of the thresher's visit. Indeed, so established was her reputation that it was the fixed policy of the Powers gang to get to Stead's as soon as possible and to remain as long as circumstances would permit. This year Mrs. Stead was placed at a special disadvantage. It had been understood that the threshers would move to Lowdy's from Gordon's before coming to Stead's. But an insurrection which had been simmering in the gang for some days came to a head that very afternoon. Mrs. Lowdy's reputation for cooking was at the opposite pole from that of Mrs. Stead's, and while the mill was stopped for a few minutes for the repair of a broken belt, a knot of men gathered around Powers and reckoned that they'd move to Stead's as soon as they had cleaned up at Gordon's. Powers scratched his ear with a hand black with engine oil as he received this ultimatum. "But, gosh, boys," he expostulated, "I promised Loudy I'd go there next, and he's got everything ready. Can't hardly pass him up now." "Nothin' doin'," said the spokesman of the gang. "I threshed at Loudy's last year, and I cut him off my visitin' list from that time henceforth. Nothin' doin'." "That's right," said another. "Salt pork she fed us. Doesn't seem to know there's a butcher shop in Plainville. Send her that word, Bill, and let's move to Steaks tonight." "But Mrs. Steak ain't ready," Bill argued. "Ain't looking for us for 3 days. 'Tain't fair to Mrs. Steak, boys, to stampede in on her like that." There was a laugh of derision at this defense. "You'd think you didn't know Mrs. Steak to hear you talk. Send her word now, and I'll bet she'll be all set for us by morning, with fresh beef and pumpkin pie for tomorrow's dinner, or I'll eat your overalls, and they don't look none too appetizing." "And what'll I tell Mrs. Loudy?" Powers pleaded. "It's kind of rotten on her." "Not a bit more rotten than the grub she set out for us a year ago. Tell her you hear they got some fine juicy quarters of beef at the Plainville butcher shop, and the boys has decided to give her 2 or 3 days more to make her preparations." Powers gave in, as a man must who isn't in a position to pay off his mutineers, and a spare hand was sent with the word to Mrs. Steak. "Well, for the solar sake of me," that good woman exclaimed, when the man in the door announced that the threshers would pull over from Gordon's that night. "What do you think I am, a hotel?" "Sure, Mum, it'll be all right. The boys say, 'Leave it to Mrs. Steak,' they says. 'She won't be stuck.'" And with this little speech he departed, leaving Susie Steak torn between pride in her well-earned reputation and misgivings over how it could be maintained on such short notice. So the afternoon had been a busy one for Mrs. Steak. She was fortunate in flagging a messenger to town as he went by on the main road and sending in an order for supplies which would be delivered late that night. In the meantime she attacked her baking and the preparation of her vegetables. When Gander came in to supper, he found a plate of potatoes with 2 fried eggs on top thrust at him. He ate it off a corner of the woodbox, the table being fully occupied with his mother's activities. Gander had just cleaned his plate when a tap came at the door. Not a man's knock, but a hesitating, gentle little tap. "Well, for the solar sake of me," Mrs. Steak exclaimed for the 50th time that day, "ain't I got enough without visitors?" Then, her sense of courtesy righting itself, she began scraping her doughy hands on the back of the knife. "Open the door, William," she commanded. "What you sitting there gawking about?" Gander opened the door and beheld a mite about his own size or smaller in the wedge of light from the table lamp. It was Josephine Burge. "Hello, Joe," said Gander. "Come in." Mrs. Steak peered at her collar. "Why, if it ain't little Joey Burge! My, but it's late for you to be out. Are you all alone?" "Yes'm," said Joe, wriggling under Mrs. Steak's gaze and slipping her arm about Minnie, who had left her potato peeling and edged up beside her. "If you please, Mother sent me to say she'd come over in the morning and help you if you like." "Well, now, I declare, that's right good of your Ma. That's what I call neighborly. These con-suffered threshers come plunking in on me without a moment's notice." "That's what Mother said when she heard," the little girl agreed, "and she sent me over." "All by yourself? Ain't it pretty dark?" "Yes'm. Tommy couldn't get away 'cause my father's helping at the threshing, and he ain't home yet. So I came. I know the road well, and it'll be moonlight going back." "Well, that's a right smart girl. You won't have had your supper." Josephine hesitated. "Well, some," she admitted. "Guess you could get a couple of these buns inside of you without busting," Mrs. Steak suggested, "especially if they was greased with a dish of corn syrup." She broke 2 fresh brown buns from a great panful, poured some golden syrup into a saucer, and drew the little girl up to a corner which she cleared on the table. Any supper in which Josephine had already indulged had no difficulty in making way for the new arrivals. "Threshing's a powerful hard time on women," her hostess commented as she resumed the kneading of a panful of dough. "The men hire lots of help for threshing, but the women just gotta hitch up and go to it. I'm waiting till Minnie grows up. If she don't light out about the time she's some use, like most of 'em do." Well, it's a God's goodness of your ma to come over tomorrow. Thank her kindly for me and tell her I'll say some odds and ends for her to do. Or maybe she better bring her fancy work. Maybe we'll both do a little fancy work between meals, eh, Joey? The little girl smiled suitably at this sarcastic humor and finished her second bun. Mrs. Stake was too occupied with her work to notice that the second bun had been finished, and presently Josephine wriggled to her feet. "Well, I guess I better be going," she said. "Yes, your ma'll be uneasy if you're late. William'll run home with you for company. Get your hat, William, and run home with Joey, and don't stay." "Can I go?" piped Minnie. "Can I go, Ma? Can I, Ma?" "You're too small. You couldn't keep up," said Gander. He liked his sister Minnie well enough, but he had a mature instinct that this was no occasion to encourage her presence. "Yes, you're too small." Their mother dismissed the subject. "Besides, I need you here. Skip along now, William, and hurry back. And tell your ma I'm ever so much obliged." It was understood that the closing sentence was intended for Josephine. The two children were at once on their way, running lightly through the groves of poplar and willow that shut the farm buildings from the high road, picking their steps deftly in the darkness. It was not until they emerged on the road allowance that they drew up to a walk. Gander had a feeling that this was a time for speech, but he had no idea what to say. He was not a romantic boy in the sense of being a worshipper of heroes and heroines. The few books which the Stake household afforded were without interest to him. His little sister, only 7 years old, was already a better reader than he. Gander hated school and he hated books, but he loved horses and machines, and he suspected that he loved Josephine Burge. But he had no words in which to express his sentiment. He had no models to copy. And after all, what need of words? He reached out and took Joe's hand in his, and again they ran on together. When they stopped for a breath, a full moon was shoving a blood-red segment over the crest of the world. They paused to look at it, and then turned their eyes to the glow from burning straw piles on all quarters of the horizon. For in this way, for lack of a better market, do the farmers lavish their humus and nitrogen into the air. "They look like moons, don't they?" said Josephine. "Yep, a little," said Gander, and again they ran on together. Presently the long, sharp note of a thresher's whistle cut across the night. They stopped to listen. "They're through at Gordon's," Gander remarked. "They'll be moving now." "They'll be coming up this road, won't they?" Josephine asked. "Yep, I guess." "They'll see us, won't they?" A pause. "I guess." "Do you care?" "Nope. Neither do I." Then they walked, and Gander felt his tongue unloosed. "Guess I won't be going to school no more," he remarked. "No more?" "Any more." Josephine was not quite a hater of books. "Why?" "Jackie's lit out, and I got to work." "I heard about that. Will he come back?" "Dunno. He can stay for all I care." This was a confidential discussion of great interest, and Josephine waited for her companion to continue. About the Burges' table the going of young Jackson had been analyzed with no very satisfactory conclusions. As Gander did not speak, she led him out. "But you have a hired man now. He can do the work when the threshing's over, and you can go to school." "Hired men ain't much good," said Gander. "Besides, I don't want to go to school." "I wish you would. It's as lonely at school without you." This confession silenced both for another 100 yards. "Maybe I'll go a little while in winter," Gander conceded. They could now hear the panting of the steam engine, and the voices of men carried curiously distinct through darkness now thinning in the ruddy light of the rising moon. As they crested a hill they saw the black caterpillar of the outfit stretched before them, Bill Powers walking ahead with a lantern, on the lookout for stones and badger holes, and the engine following solemnly a few yards behind. The high road was little more than a prairie trail, with ruts too close for the wide-geared trucks of the engine, so that one side ran on the road and the other on the virgin prairie sod. The light from Power's lantern glinted on the front wheels of the engine as they wobbled drunkenly but irresistibly along their uneven course. A sharper exhaust snorted out as they struck the grade of the hill, and Gander and Josephine drew over as far as the field that bordered the road to let the outfit pass by. Here they could watch unobserved. Their boast about indifference to public opinion had been sheer bravado.